what is propaganda? Propaganda usually comes from the government, although there are a lot of enablers, whether it's big tech or Wall Street or the media. So there are a lot of amplifiers, but it usually can be sourced to the government. It's designed to create a perception, persuade people of certain things. Unfortunately, people tend to trust their governments. I think that's probably a bad idea. I think history says it's usually a bad idea, not always, but usually. So in the first instance, people hear the government say, the economy's fine, or unemployment's near an all-time low, which actually statistically is true, and they kind of nod and go, yeah, it's all good. And then reality is the stuff that hits you in the head like a 2x4, which is, you go to the gas station and with US dollar prices anyway, ones I'm familiar with, it used to be $45 to fill up your tank. Now it's $85 or $90. I don't drive a pickup truck, but I hear from the F-150, the Ford F-150 is the most popular pickup truck in America. I think they sell more of them than they do cars, but those I think are now to like $150 to fill it up, probably a 20-gallon tank. So that's the reality. So all of a sudden you're like, well, wait a second, White House is saying it's all good, but the price of gas has doubled. And then there are all kinds of ripple effects from that, which is you have to fill up your car. You've got to put food on the table. You got to pay for the roof over your head. If all those things are costing more, which they are, that's very clear. That's less money for everything else. Maybe you're not taking your spouse out to dinner on Friday. Maybe you're not buying new clothes or taking a vacation. You're going to cut out all those other things. So yeah, you're spending money but on the necessities, but it means there's demand destruction on anything that's not necessary, and that's a big part of the economy because of service sector and all the people who cater to that. So the propaganda is positive. We can talk about that in a little more detail. The reality is harsh, and reality wins. Because you're paying real money, as I described. I don't put a lot of stock in anything Jamie Dimon says. He says the hurricane's coming. All right, what does that mean? I don't really buy into metaphor. Give me data, give me analysis. I'll listen to that. I have my own data. Well, not unique to me, but data that I focus on, perhaps more so than others. My own models. So, and I put that out there, and I'm happy to debate it, or, if people have a critique, I'm always listening, but it's sort of, kind of has to be fact-based. Now, you mentioned the word narrative, and that's really important. And there's a very good book on this by Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize winning economist at Yale University. I'm not a huge fan of your garden variety PhD economists, but there are some good ones out there, and he's one of them. He wrote a book about, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, called Narrative Economics. And he said, we got all the models and Phillips curve and wealth effect and various quantity theory money, and some have a place, some are more valuable than others, but don't underestimate the power of a narrative. A narrative is a story. It's basically it's a fancy name for a story, but a story that persists, that grows. And interestingly, and I'd done this some years ago, it was interesting to see he glommed onto the same model, which I think is really perceptive. In epidemiology, of course, we've just come through a pandemic, and that we're all, kind of amateur epidemiologists, but I had studied it for other reasons. There's a model called the SCIR model that stands for susceptible. Are you susceptible to a virus? E for exposed. Are you exposed to it? I, are you infected? Did you get it? And R, did you recover? The difference between I and R are people who died. But it's a model, and it's mathematically based, and it's empirically validated of how viruses spread exponentially. And you can also use it to forecast how a virus is going to go. I wouldn't listen much to the Imperial College in London, but there are other people who do some pretty good forecasting with that. Well, what Shiller did, he took that model, moved it over to economics, and took a narrative kind of like a virus, not in a negative sense, but just as something that spreads. And it can be very powerful, and then eventually may die out or reverse, but it can be powerful in the meantime. That much I knew, but what I learned from the book that I hadn't really thought about is that narratives don't have to be true. They can be true, and they can be very powerful, but a narrative can be false and still be powerful. If it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes the reality to some extent, even if it's based on false premises. He gives an example during the Great Depression. The Great Depression really was two technical recessions, but there was a period from 1929 to 1933, election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Then there was another period from 1933 to 1937. The 37 and 1940 part we leave aside for this purpose. But during the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, productivity was, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative, but it's the worst possible economic advice, because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending that kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Now, when FDR came along, was elected in 1933, became president in 1934, the psychology turned 180 degrees, and all of a sudden, the Democratic campaign song was "Happy Days Are Here Again," and FDR seemed to solve the banking crisis and so forth. And all of a sudden, it became okay to spend money. Well, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1934 to 1936, those were some of the strongest years ever for the stock market, and unemployment did come down a lot. Now, the problem is it came down from like 25% to 15%. Well, 15% is still, painfully high, but it was a big move in the right direction. So he describes how the narrative flipped from "don't spend money, it's poor form" to go spend money and help the economy. None of that is taught in business school. It's not taught in economics. It can be modeled using this epidemiology model, but it doesn't fit into any of the standard macroeconomic models. But it's powerful stuff. And so today, what's going on is that the White House is trying to push a narrative, and they're failing badly. But they'll say, if you listen to the deliberations among White House officials, some of the stuff leaks to the press, and I know some of these people. It's like the economy's great, unemployment's really low. We've created all these jobs since the pandemic, but we're doing a really bad job of messaging. We can't. Biden is screaming at his staff. The communication staff are quitting in droves. The correct analysis is that there is no positive economic story. The economy is in terrible shape. The problem is not the messaging, it's the message. And, obviously the inflation, which is now out of control, and, Biden's failures to get certain legislation through, and then pushing legislation through that actually caused the inflation or contributed to it. I think Larry Summers did a good job of outlining that. So, and more, but it's just kind of one disaster after another. But where we are today, the Putin price hike, I'll give the writer credit for good alliteration. Putin price hike. Okay, I'm a writer, so hey, nice job. But it's completely false. Number one, the inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything was great until February 27th, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up. All right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory. And then finally, I think Jay Powell was testifying before Congress in I want to say January, could have been early February, but he said it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. So it predates the war, number one. Number two, energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine, it's because the U.S. counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president, and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. And then the hub distributes it to the entire country.